My name is Jessica Yllemo. I am an executive committee member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, and I am pleased to moderate this panel today. I would also like to take the opportunity to flag for folks, anyone that was here last year was part of the team presenting our ongoing research project, Project CASA, the project on climate and security action through civil-military cooperation in climate-related emergencies. Hence why we shortened it to Project CASA. That report is finally out or will be out after 2 years of research. We have 19 countries involved, so that will be out toward the end of the month. So should you be interested in climate emergencies and civil military relations, that will be out on www.projectcasa.org by the end of the month, or you can reach out to me or Tom or any of the other people in this room that have been involved. So thank you for that. With that, I am pleased to turn the floor over to newly honorary Dr. Louise Beaumais. She is an associate PhD at the Center for International Research. She works on on the use of numbers in foreign policy through a comparative case study of French and British Arctic policy. As a member of the ANR Data War program, she has also explored early warning systems for conflicts and quantification within humanitarian organizations. So, Doctor, it's over to you.
So, good morning. I would like to say first how much I am delighted to be here today. So, climate security has proven to be a very important dimension of my research. So it has been extremely valuable for me to be able to hear so many of you talk about it. So for my thesis, as Jessica told us, I work on the use of numbers in foreign policy with a dual case study of the French and British Arctic policies. And to understand how and why numbers were used, I needed first to reconstruct the Arctic policy process. And in doing so, I came across an interesting puzzle that will be the starting point of this communication, for which I will focus specifically on the French case. The puzzle goes like this. Considering that the Arctic is at the heart of climate security discourses and that the French MOD is greening its military, it is often assumed that the French MOD in its Arctic policy is producing a climate security-oriented discourse. And I've put some of the maps that are within the French MOD policy paper that dates back of 2019 to give you a little bit of example of how it represents the region, but I will go back to that in the presentation. So this communication aims to kind of offer a critical reading of this puzzle. And because it is based on my thesis materials, it draws on an analysis of official and internal documents, as well as around 40 interviews within the French MOD. And I will go through 3 main points. So the first one is that we are going to get back at how the French MOD frames Arctic dynamics to show that they are in fact primarily interpreted through the lens of traditional threats, whether conventional or nuclear, and that requires very traditional missions. Next, I will explore the mechanism behind this resistance to the climatization of Arctic security through a study of organizational imaginaries rooted in the Cold War. And finally, I will go through the implications of such a stance, which ultimately comes at the expense of a comprehensive and renewed approach that would integrate environmental challenges into strategic planning. So to tell you a little bit about the way the Arctic and Arctic dynamics are framed within the French MOD. So the start of the Arctic policy process in France can be traced back to 2007. And while the main actors of the policy was the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MFA, the French MOD was already involved in various ways, notably by writing reports to clarify the French army's positions. And the leadership was, however, in the hands of the MFA. And after the publication of the MFA's Arctic policy paper in 2016, the MOD decided to invest more in its Arctic policy. And between 2016 and 2019, the newly appointed mission head for Arctic and Antarctic missions undertook this kind of comprehensive consultation within the ministry to identify the key elements for developing the organization perspective. And this ultimately resulted in the publication of a strategic framework related to the Arctic in 2019. So in it, the Arctic is defined as a region of growing strategic interests, and the starting point is the following. The rapid and uncertain evolution of the Arctic fosters security dynamics that are linked to the opening of new sea routes, the route for Arctic resources, and increasing sovereignty claims, all that will inevitably lead to increased military activity. So I put an abstract of the document, but we have been going through this already this morning, but just so you see how it kind of is embodied within the French document. So here it emphasizes on Russia, on China, and basically on economic prospects mainly, and remilitarization. So 2 ways of acting in the Arctic are anticipated. The first one is support to the civilian sectors, because economic activities linked to resource extraction and tourism in the Arctic mean an expanding role in search and rescue operation and the need to ensure safety of critical infrastructures. And as maritime traffic grows and resource-based activities intensify, the French military may be called upon to provide response capabilities to assist in emergencies, for instance. But perhaps the most important ways of acting in the Arctic that is anticipated is as part of the MOD primary missions, that is military operations. Especially as a member of NATO, like the policy paper recall how France is committed to a large spectrum of mission, especially since the Arctic is of importance, of strategic importance in France's nuclear deterrence posture. So not only areas like the Barents Sea and the North Atlantic provide a strategic environment for the deployment and concealment of nuclear submarines, and the control over Arctic waters can provide significant advantages in military positioning. So the growing Russian presence alongside the Arctic coast in the high north and increasing accessibility of the region have increased its significance. And this has taken, of course, another dimensions following the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in particular with Sweden and Finland adhesion to NATO. And finally, there is also some anticipation that is mentioned within the policy paper, and that was really mentioned during interviews regarding a potential Chinese military threat in the Arctic. So not economic threat, but really military threat, and in particular, question regarding potential Chinese nuclear threat in the Arctic. So basically what it is a great power rivalries narrative, very traditional threats, issues, and missions. So I realized that none of this actually was about climate and climate security. So to be fair, climate change is mentioned in the policy paper and has been discussed in the majority of interviews. So for instance, the document does mention it in the minister's foreword, and in the first page, there is 3 paragraphs dedicated to, I quote, the effect of climate change and its unprecedented transformation in the Arctic region. So in that, there is an acknowledgement of the links between climate change and security issues, and the role given to climate change is one of explicitly contextual elements, and it was the same during interviews. This was kind of the first thing they would mention and then never speak about it again. And implicitly of a threat multiplier, so recognizing how climate change exacerbates existing tensions, and when I was talking about the great power rivalries narrative, it's in this frame. And the use of the threat multiplier frame is not surprising in itself, and I think that there is a very good article that was published recently by Rob Cullum on this, the use of the threat multiplier frame within organizations, within defense organizations, where it shows that it has a very consensual nature that allows its linking back to a broad range of organizational priorities. But the thing is, I was even surprised of how narrow the application of the threat multiplier frame was in the policy. So when I started my research, I was convinced that part of the French MOD narrative will deal with the consequences of rising sea ice levels for national security. So I was expecting discussions in terms of impact on their coastlines, economies, infrastructures, societies, and even migration pressures, because it has been one of the main ways environmental issues have been linked to security in the country. But I found little evidence of this, even during interviews. So I believe that the reason for this has to do with the importance of the Cold War imaginary within the organization. It would be very long to go into details about what I mean by the Cold War imaginary, but basically it is based on, one, the importance of Russia, and two, the perception of the Arctic as a political chessboard. So here, sorry, it's very long, but it's quite telling, and I think it's interesting. It's an interview abstract that I found very telling, yes, on the importance of Russia. And the explanation behind, so I will let you read and I will continue to speak, but yeah, because I think it's really valuable. So the explanation behind the strength of this imaginary is probably twofold. The first one, and I could go back to this afterwards. The first one is that it's an imaginary that is anchored in numbers. So this was a map that the same military showed me when he was mentioning the importance of Russia. And he told me, there is everything you need to know here. This is the return to the Cold War era. And he used that in a presentation within the Ministry of Defense. And because it is anchored in numbers, it's extremely difficult to contest. Even if there are debates on the interpretation of the said numbers, there is this impression that it's going back to the Cold War. The second element that explains this strength is the uncertainty of Arctic futures make it difficult to predict specific risks. So I think, and I was working on, with the work of Alexandra Aumolard, the fact that the uncertainty of Arctic futures makes it easier to rely on analogies. So in particular, from an organizational perspective, framing the Arctic in relatively conventional terms as part of great power rivalries represents a return to classical themes, practices, and missions that call to the organization essence, if we take an organizational perspective, but you have understood perhaps that I use one, contrary to the environment where it requires adaptation. So the implication of this perception, of course, is that we are far from a comprehensive and renewed approach that would integrate environmental challenges into strategic planning. And I was thinking about the consequences of this very narrow perception of climate change as a threat multiplier. The first one is that, considering the importance of deterrence in the Arctic, it continues to assume that the links between nuclear arsenal and ongoing environmental transformations are completely independent, where in fact there have been a very good study by some of my colleagues in Sciences Po about the feedback loops between the two, which provide very interesting avenues for further research, I think. Second, and more generally, it omits important elements of the Arctic environment security nexus, in that it also completely overlooks the fact that some indigenous people are already experiencing this impact, which will likely worsen due to this national security-focused discourse, and this was not acknowledged in interviews. And third, it certainly narrows the possible solutions to address the issue, as was discussed this morning, and the study by Rob Cullum that I've mentioned earlier, it also explained how the climate threat multiplier in general creates a dismal and limited future in which national security systems adopt a reactive and managerial posture toward the effect of climate change, which go back to discussions that we had yesterday. So, in conclusion, even if the Arctic is at the heart of climate security discussion, and that the French MOD is apparently greening its strategies and doctrines, the French Arctic policy is not one of climate security, but one focused on very conventional and nuclear military issues and missions. Oh, and the reason behind this is the strength of the Cold War imaginary, strength that is explained by the fact that it is rooted in numbers and that as Arctic future is uncertain, it makes it easier to rely on analogy. And ultimately, I think this raises question on the adaptation of French army to climate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beaumais. Charlotte is up next. Charlotte Desmasures is a second-year PhD student at the Center for International Studies of Sciences, Po, Paris, and a visiting researcher at UQAM. Her research looks at the evolution of multilateral security institutions in the light of climate change, using NATO as a case study. In parallel, she is interested in scientific multilateralism and international climate negotiations. She is also teaching courses at Sciences Po Paris. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm really pleased to be able today to present some outlooks of my thesis. So today I'm going to give you a little overview of a research topic that I tackled within the framework of my thesis. So this communication is entitled, and I changed the title as usual, When Science Embraces Politics, NATO and Climate Issues Before the 2000s. So since the 2020s, NATO has produced its own understanding and vision of the impact of climate change, as well as the role that the military and a military alliance can and should have in the face of it. This vision, which is a product of NATO's diplomatic and political circles and also NATO's international bureaucracy, has been enjoying a degree of consensus within the alliance until last January. However, this presentation aims to shed light on the social and historical underpinnings of the role that the military alliance is taking on with regard to climate change and deconstruct the idea of this political consensus. So as I'm asking the following questions. Is NATO's concerns about climate change just a contemporary issue? When climate change became a political issue in the 1980s, how did NATO position itself in relation to these debates? So the objectives of this presentation are multifold. I first want to go beyond short-termist analysis prevalent in academic and think tank literature on NATO, which trace the integration of climate issues into NATO's concerns back to between 2010 and 2020, and consequently focus solely on the political agenda. But NATO has also a scientific dimension that we don't want to forget. And I also want to reconstruct the first steps of the institutionalization of climate issues since NATO's creation, and to make sense of the complex role of NATO scientific circles in putting climate issues on the agenda before the 2000s. And lastly, I want to put also the emergence of an epistemic community on climate security into historical perspective. So my argument, and my main argument, is that the early climatization of NATO, which unfolded through a politicization of climate issues, was initiated at the margins of the organization through its scientific committees. And so at the crossroads of the 1980s and the 1990s, at a time when NATO's political circles were not concerned or even reluctant to take up climate-related issues into their program of work, the Alliance scientific circles seized upon it to start thinking about the role that the military and also NATO could play in relation to ozone depletion and climate change, both within NATO and also at the international level. Briefly on the theoretical framework, so I'm drawing on conceptual contribution on epistemic communities from constructivist and a sociological perspective, but I also want to enhance the heuristic value of the concept by relying on organizational sociology applied to international relations, because it makes possible to reinsert epistemic communities into a constellation of plural actors who form and make up international organizations, who do science, who do politics, who do both, who interact or not. and also coupled with historical institutionalism, because I think it allows to assess the formation and influence of epistemic communities over a wider time frame. Also briefly on the data collection, so the methodology used to frame this work is primarily qualitative. In order to study institutional developments over the long term, the use of the organization's archives was of paramount importance. So I've digged into NATO's archive at the HQ last year and eventually rely on digitized documents and paper archives from the NATO Science Committee, the Committee on the Challenges of Modern Society, the Private Office of the Secretary General, as well as the North Atlantic Council. And I'm also relying on papers archives from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, as well as online documentation. So now about the results. So first, I'm going to tackle how, I'm going to just give an overview of the scientific community's views on climate issues and how a military alliance puts itself at the service of science. So while the development of a political agenda around climate change at NATO is often highlighted as emerging around the 2020s, it will be, however, inaccurate to assert that the organization did not address the issue earlier. So a close look at the archives shows that NATO was concerned with climate issues as early as the 1950s and more systematically in the decades that followed. So to make a long story short, the climate and climate change issues were first and foremost a topic taken up by NATO scientific circles. And there is a primarily functional reason for that. At the end of the 1950s, NATO developed its scientific dimension with the establishment of the Science Committee in 1958, also called the third dimension of NATO. And so it's therefore quite naturally that climate-related issues were framed scientifically before being considered as an object of political concern. This process, also called scientization, refers to an explicit emphasis on the ultimate value of the rational analysis of all physical and social phenomena, and refers to the process by which political or policy issues are framed, interpreted, or managed primarily through scientific knowledge. For your information, I found, I think, the first mention of climatic changes in the archives of the Science Committee as early as 1959. And so at that time, the Science Committee considered to sponsor a study of climatic changes, especially in the Atlantic region, where very striking changes have occurred in recent decades. I was quoting a document there. And so until the beginning of the 1980s, NATO's Science Committee invariably sponsored studies on the climate system, especially in the field of meteorological studies, and more attention was then being paid to the climate system and its disruption within the NATO science program on global transport mechanisms in the geosciences initiated in 1983. But I think that the most revealing case of this scientization process is the establishment of a research program by the Science Committee in 1989 entitled the NATO Special Program on the Science of Global Climate Change. And so its primary aim was to generate multidisciplinary research to understand and predict climate change. And so this special program on climate change held 56 workshops followed by 56 publications, such as Global Environmental Change, helping to structure climate science within NATO. However, this scientization removes any political framing and understanding of climate change. I'm quoting a document here. In its variety of activities, the program will always address scientific rather than political issues. Then I'm going to tackle the political community's views on climate issues. So in parallel with this scientific effervescence on climate issues, NATO's political community, be it the North Atlantic Council or the Private Office of the Secretary General, did not take on board the climate issue and even maintain the scientific framing of the topic. First, they call for further scientific research, I quote, to understand better the phenomena associated with ozone depletion and climate change. And they also preserve the Science Committee and the Special Program on Climate Change as the body and instrument of reference to deal with climate change. However, when it comes to consider measures to curb climate change, NATO's political community completely evades and dodges the question. And this is especially noticeable in the answer of the Secretary General Manfred Werner to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in 1989, after the Assembly adopted a resolution urging the member governments of the North Atlantic Alliance to give the highest priority to the problem of global warming in national policy by setting targets for the reduction of trace gas emission. And so in his answer, the Secretary General completely evades the question of political measures, concentrating instead on scientific cooperation again. Nonetheless, I think I identified a slight change in the stance of NATO's political circles in the 1990s, and this can be seen again in the answer of the Secretary General Manfred Werner to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in 1991, this time after it adopted a resolution urging member governments to take a number of steps to reduce ozone depletion and mitigate the climatic changes resulting therefrom. In his answer, the Secretary General, even if he again insists on the need to expand scientific research, he opens the way to other avenues of framing and solving climate change outside of the scientific realm, setting the stage for politicization. And I quote, "In supporting these efforts, I do not wish to imply that science alone is the key to solving these problems. Clearly, there is also a need to explore methods which could facilitate the setting up of limits on greenhouse gas emission." Then, lastly, things began to change a bit within the scientific circles of NATO with the emergence of an epistemic community on climate issues between the 1990s and the 2000s. So, an epistemic community refers to a network of professionals with recognized expertise and competence in a particular domain and an authoritative claim to policy-relevant knowledge within that domain or issue area. And I'm quoting Peter Haas. And unlike scientific communities, epistemic communities produce and act with knowledge. They produce knowledge, publicize it, and politicize it, and eventually disseminate it. And so the emergence of an epistemic community on climate issues was orchestrated by the NATO Committee on the Challenges of Modern Society. The CCMS was a standing committee established in 1969, and its research mainly focused on environmental or societal issues. And from the mid-1980s, it developed a program of defense-related environmental studies. And from the beginning of the 1990s, it developed two different lines of research focusing on climate-related issues, but not climate change or climate security per se, as you will see. So one strain of research focused from 1991 on the role that the military, of the military in protecting the ozone layer. And so in this matter, the CCMS co-organized 3 international technical conferences to foster exchanges on specific issues, such as speeding up military phase-outs of ozone-depleting substances, such as halons and CFCs. And these conferences had 2 effects. First, a technicization of climate-related issues, which is reflected in the fact that the management of the ozone hole problem has been approached as a technical challenge entrusted to scientific experts, engineers, and defense institutions. And so the aim was to identify alternatives that were compatible with operational requirements by developing technologies to replace halons. And then the second effect is a militarization of climate issues. Given that the armed forces are the biggest users of ozone-depleting substances, such as halons, it provided a rationale for military institutions to engage in climate governance, and this granted them legitimacy to reframe and manage climate-related issues through defense policy. And the other strand of research laid out by the CCMS was initiated in 1996 with a pilot study entitled Environment and Security in an International Context. And a series of workshops and publications were held and published and started off to securitize climate change as part of developing the environmental security concept. And I think that this work done by the CCMS has made it possible to engage in a minimalist politicization of climate issues. To conclude, while securitization has been the prevalent framing of climate issues since 2010 and the 2020s at NATO, with a narrow focus on climate security, other approaches and focus have prevailed in the past. I showed you today a historical perspective of NATO's climate agenda by showing its scientific ramifications. And this helps us to understand that there's been a multifaceted, a multidimensional, and an evolving framing of climate issues at NATO since its creation, between scientization, depoliticization, politicization, technicization, and eventually militarization. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next up is Dr. Christine Nam. Dr. Nam is a senior climate scientist with over 15 years of experience working with satellite retrievals and climate models in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary environment. Dr. Nam's work focuses on the extraction and customization of indices from climate model projections to help assess and identify climate risks which impact operations in a variety of sectors, including critical infrastructure, health, coastal tourism, and space, just to name a few. Dr. Nam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be presenting my work here today, so thank you for the opportunity. So today I want to talk about safeguarding European space and the need for what I see as operationalized climate services. I want to say that this work has actually been funded by a European Horizon Europe project. And this is just to remind Canadian institutes that they can now be a part of Horizon projects in Europe, and you should really use your potential network of Canadian expats outside that have a network. So, now, I promised my project manager I would give a talk about, to describe the Sunrise Project. And believe it or not, it is about pandemics. So we're going to talk about pandemics, space, and the climate security nexus. Hold on to your hats. So the Sunrise Project is actually a project that was supposed to learn from COVID-19 so that we can ensure vital services during a pandemic for critical infrastructure. So we are a consortium of 30 partners or so that includes national authorities, operators of critical infrastructure, including water, telecommunications, electricity, and rail. And then we have domain experts such as myself in climate, we have health experts, as well as cybersecurity experts. And one of the main project goals was to identify pandemic-specific vital services in critical infrastructure so that we could define their dependencies, their risks, and assess their cascading effects, and so that we could develop strategies and tools to ensure their reliability. In our dialogues with stakeholders, there were two statements that really stuck out with me. The first one was, it doesn't matter what causes the disruption, it just needs to be fixed. And so this made me realize, even with the most tangible critical infrastructure, we are reactionary and not proactive in our preparations. The second one, when I asked them about climate, they went, that's a security concern. That's a safety concern, not a security concern. And that made me realize that it's very siloed in our thinking. And so that made me think, well, when does a safety concern become a security concern? And I'm sure for all of you, the first thing that jumped into your head was space infrastructure, right? So those of you who don't know, our society, both civilians and security experts, rely on space infrastructure for three main things: telecommunications, navigations, and Earth observations. And our space infrastructure is global, and it includes 5 segments. You have the stuff that's in space, then there's the ground segments, we have launch segments, link segments, and user segments. And climate-related hazards have the potential to disrupt all these segments. And so you can imagine it's essential that European space infrastructure should be resilient to climate change. A brief introduction to the Guyana Space Center. This is where Europe, the launch site is, the main launch site is in French Guiana in a city called Kourou. And it was established in 1964 after the independence of Algiers. And it was a very attractive place to build a space center because of its proximity to the equator, the eastern coast, and the low risk of tropical cyclones and low population density. So this is the primary launch site for low Earth orbit and geostationary orbit. And it's a critical component of this Europe's space infrastructure because it provides members autonomous access to space, and more specifically, different orbits. And I think this is something that's often neglected when we talk about autonomous access to space. So, in case of damage or destruction of a satellite, you have to get your satellites up. It's important that you can replenish them. Back in the 50s, the historical city of Kourou was built further inland in the river on clay soil. And this was because the indigenous people of French Guiana were accustomed to the highly dynamic nature of the coastlines. They were used to strong tides and waves that could cause the coastline to retreat by tens of meters in a few months or even several kilometers in a few years. But when the French went in the 60s, they had a bit of a colonial mindset, and they said, no, the director of the European Space Agency needs to have a villa looking at the ocean. So they built it right at the tip, looking out the ocean. This is on sand soil, and the indigenous people said, well, no, that part belongs to the sea. So it doesn't matter, the whole city was built up, the modern city is there. This is where everybody in French Guiana who works at the Space Center lives. So I want you to keep that in mind. There was an additional problem that in the 90s, they told the French Legion, to go around and take out the mangroves because they were destroying the views from the villas. So now we have chronic flooding today in the city, and we have coastal erosion. So you can imagine that any adaptation that we want to talk about in the future should include indigenous knowledge, and we have to address some root challenges that are the remote location, weaker infrastructure, and social inequality. And you can imagine that some of these things might echo here in Canada. And one of the challenges is that when there's social inequality, it has the opportunity where people were protesting and they can disrupt satellite transfer, like logistics, because of their activism. So here's a map of the Space Center, where you can see like the old launch site of the Ariane 5. There's the city of the Kourou, and the Ariane 6, the new launch site's even a little bit closer to the coast and a little bit more north. And it's only 2 kilometers away from the sea. And in addition, on the site, you'll see that they have, of course, naturally a fuel production plant, and because it's doing rocket fuel, it's actually classified as a Seveso 3 entity, which means that it has a very comprehensive disaster risk management plan. But I want to advocate for the fact that disaster risk management is not climate risk management. And that is because traditional risk assessments always considered individual hazards. So you had hazard by hazard thinking, and you applied the probabilities and intensities based on historical events. So things that you are not addressing are the changes in the frequency, duration, and intensity of a hazard, the projected changes in the overall environment, which includes coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion, increased temperature exposure. And so I'm saying that climate risk assessments need to include climate projections. So if I've convinced you that we ought to do a climate risk assessment for space infrastructure, you're going to actually come across 2 hurdles. And the first hurdle is the regular production of climate projections. And that's because simulations of climate projections are not operationalized in a similar manner as weather forecasts. We are actually coordinating amongst ourselves internationally as scientists on a voluntary basis when we get funding within short-term projects, and that includes CMIP 567. That's the global climate models. And global climate models, this is just an important fact, that they have a resolution of approximately 100 by 100 kilometer grid boxes. And when you look in the future for any site that you're interested in, you should take like a 3 by 3 grid around it. So you have like 900 square kilometers. So sometimes when you have very sharp changes in land or sea or orography, you want to have a regional climate model projection. And that's all the Cortex stuff that you'll see there. And those in Europe, we have a very high resolution, but our institute advocated for global regional climate projections over where people live, but the rest of the world only has 25 by 25 kilometers. And so all these climate change or related hazards are usually calculated from these simulations. So it's not to say that France hasn't done an environmental risk assessment. The whole point of the slide is just to say that there's no mention in any of these reports about the Guyana Space Center or the 16 Seveso 3 sites. So I have no idea what they are or are not doing. If it was strategically important, they have not considered it. Yeah, and they're using the global climate model. So they're doing these 900-kilometer assessments, if at anything, like these. The second hurdle I see is the customization of climate information. So climate model output is not immediately usable by managers or decision makers of day-to-day functions of critical infrastructure, because it's like temperature, precipitation, humidity. So you have to put a lot of effort to co-develop a customized indices and extract that localized information that's relevant and useful for decision makers. And that's where climate services comes in. And usually we are funded by short-term projects, and consequently, once that project is done, it's hard to say whether or not it's going to be carried forward. It's not operational. So I'm advocating for climate services because we want to co-develop climate-relevant information. Through stakeholder dialogues, we can articulate how risks are identified, assessed. We can map the system so that you could help identify critical functions, so that we could quantify the recovery and resilience of a system. And we have to keep in mind that the unique nature of a system, the individual capacities of some user, mean that climate services look different for everybody, even those within the same sector. You can account for cascading tiers or escalating effects. So I want to show you an example using the Ariane 6 launch site, how climate services can support actionable climate knowledge. And this is first identifying the models that are fit for purpose. Because you have different areas of operations, for example, you'll see that we have things that are above the surface, on the surface, below the surface. We have things that are on land, we have things that are on water. So for your different areas of operations, you're going to be exposed to different hazards, and thus you'll need different models. Each of these models will have its own limitations and assumptions and uncertainties, and this is where you need that specific climate scientist to have discussions with. I like to say that it's like having an eye doctor, a dentist, and a knee surgeon. We all do different things and we specialize in different parts. So, for example, I'm an atmospheric scientist, so I would be translating the physical variables into more operationally relevant information. For example, you might have the same hazard, but depending on what you're looking at, if I'm looking at equipment or people, then I would need a different index, and I should customize that for you. So I'd like to see is more systematic evaluation of climate hazards, not just like floods or wildfires, but I'd like to see an assessment of the areas of operations, and then to go through the matrix of like personnel, infrastructure, facilities, equipment, importantly, data, storage, and how you transfer it, as well as your services. And then you go hazard by hazard. What are you exposed to when you think about heat stress, for example? And then the role of the climate scientist would be to help you overcome technical barriers such as data volumes, unfamiliar software, because we use stuff from like the 70s, data formats, technical infrastructure, and the scientific background. So that leads to some policy recommendations I have, which were related to to ensure European space sovereignty, and is that climate change or climate hazards ought to be added as a threat to the space domain in a similar manner which space debris is done. Now, once you acknowledge that threat, then you can build awareness of it. And so that means that we have to have increased collaboration between climate service scientists as well as security experts so that we can co-develop these climate indices to assess your critical infrastructure. And then we can operationalize this, and I think that individual nations have to do that. And so that was published in a paper that came out like just a week ago. What I want to leave you is just with like food for thought. Here's an image. This is the 50-year flood return level. This is not very much. This is what the Germans would say you need to have for, I think, roads. So this is like your engineering standard, and that's projected, and this is 2100. And you can imagine now what that would mean for European space autonomy And anything that's on the East Coast from the Americans looks kind of the same. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much. Finally, we have Professor Heidi Hardt, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and a Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council. Her research focuses on NATO, European security, alliance politics, organizational change, learning, international organizations, and gender and climate security. In addition to authoring and co-authoring articles and book chapters, Professor Hardt is the sole author of 2 books and currently working on a 3rd entitled NATO Transforms, Alliance Adaptation After Global Crisis from Afghanistan to Ukraine. Professor, the floor is yours.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Je vous remercie de l'invitation d'être ici aujourd'hui. I'm very happy to be here. It's a true pleasure. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about a co-authored paper that I have with Jackie Burns, who's both a PhD student at UC Irvine with me, so I'm under my supervision, and then she's also works with RAND as well as a senior analyst. To begin, I think today and yesterday we've heard a lot of discussion about the importance of climate security for militaries. And so for those of us coming into this, this question of how does climate matter for NATO, the answer is not always obvious, because as soon as you put climate security and NATO in the same sentence, the first reaction is, especially from policy folks, may be, why is this not a national issue, right? What does this really have to do with NATO? NATO's a multilateral organization. And I appreciate the opportunity that we just heard to hear a little bit about the history and the importance of the scientific communities in that for climate change and environmental issues more broadly to be brought into this space. The picture that you're looking at behind you is an example of some of the anecdotes that I heard in my research repeatedly about problems that were happening in the context of Afghanistan, right? NATO had a 2-decade-long operation there where, helicopters may take, years to get through the procurement process, and then ultimately, arriving on the ground, and within 3 days, the helicopter doesn't work because, people didn't think in advance about the effects of extreme heat. That example can also be taken over to the context of individual soldiers dealing with extreme heat, some cases illness, some cases death, because again, uniforms not being properly fitted, the materials not being, these kind of extreme temperatures not being taken into account. But again, to go back to this NATO question, since NATO operations are a product of the contributions of individual militaries, I think back to a conference that I was at not too long ago, celebrating the 75th anniversary of NATO. And up on a stage not too dissimilar from what we're sitting at, there was a scholar sitting with this NATO SACEUR, who's the, you can kind of think of that as the lead military chief or military official within NATO. And the question was posed about, the importance of climate as a threat. The scholar reflected on how, even among her own students, over the years she's been asking, what's the #1 threat that you view? And for the first time, she was starting to hear that climate was the #1 threat to international security more broadly. And so she asked the SACEUR to reflect on that, and you could tell he was kind of taken aback a little bit and said, the initial reaction was, oh, well, this is a long-term threat. So I kind of politely disagree with your students, and then sort of walk that back. I mean, there's a video online, you can watch it on YouTube, but reflected on the importance of the Arctic for climate security and some of the other issues that we've heard today. But I think for this particular research project, I was really interested, and Jackie Burns were really interested in thinking about not just why adaptation matters for NATO, because I think the operational component makes it very clear interoperability problems as you have an increasing reliance by some individual allies, and this greening of the military to meet politically initiated targets, climate targets, that creates interoperability problems. So can an EV, or a tank that's maybe solar powered, or an electric vehicle, can it be plugged in, if it's coming from the UK, can it be plugged in Lithuania, for example, as we're seeing. And this becomes more relevant as we're seeing a bolstering of the eastern flank. But there's also the broader question of the existential threat of climate change to NATO as an organization, issues of assets and infrastructure. This is just a picture thinking about ACT, one of NATO's two command structures. I've spent the past decade studying NATO, so I've spent a little bit of time at ACT, but as you can see here, water was 1.5 feet lower when the naval station was established at Norfolk. Today, parts of the base are close to sea level. This goes back to the initial point that I was making about this challenge of national versus international, because most of the assets, most of the infrastructure that NATO is employing are really national assets. And so then it creates challenges over this question of, ownership of who should be doing the updating of these assets and infrastructure. Certainly security consequences for every single ally we could go through and spend time if we wanted to, thinking about how wildfires are disrupting training, for example, here in Canada, or flooding that's happening in Greece and throughout the alliance. You could think. Greece probably more is dealing with wildfires, but this is, again, something that is affecting every ally. There's not an ally that's necessarily opting out of or being left out from the challenges that the climate change has been increasingly facing or creating. From the scholarship, we came into this from more of a pessimistic perspective, thinking, NATO as a political military organization, we probably will expect to see less adaptation. This is really a diffuse threat. The organizational theory scholarship, and especially organizational change scholarship, emphasizes institutional momentum. Any kind of change in general is difficult. You can imagine that not just from the management scholarship, where you've got a firm and you have a CEO at the top, but in a political military organization like NATO with now 32 members, you also have these political sensitivities to think about. So, we're thinking of this as something that adaptation should not be happening easily. Probably past institutionalization is going to drive the variation that we see in what adaptation looks like. And yet we still do observe some adaptation that has happened. We heard the historical perspective on this, but we also have now the, CASCO. We have a series of assessments and methodologies, and climate is increasingly being institutionalized into the alliance. But it's still not as clear about what the variation of looks like in terms of which issue areas in particular are being prioritized as this adaptation happens. So our question was really, why has NATO adapted to climate change in certain issue areas but not adapted them in others? And so you can go back to after 2021 with the Climate Change and Security Action Plan. You started having these series of assessments, like I mentioned. We do have some literature that's related, but that hasn't touched on our specific research question. So the argument that we put forward is kind of, given the background of this, right, that climate has increasingly become a priority for publics, which we heard about yesterday, that key allies in particular have been really interested in advocating for climate adaptation, and that even we had this convenient confluence of a Secretary General who had really deep expertise in environmental policy and in climate, being in a position where he could also advocate within the alliance for adaptation. We argue that the variation that we're seeing is really driven by the increasing pressure on NATO to put at the forefront its defense-centered identity. So NATO has 3 core tasks. collective defense, cooperative security, and crisis management. Cooperative security is heavily interested in partnerships, and you can think back on the Partnership for Peace program. Crisis management, now most recently, that's been expanded to this idea of crisis management and prevention, but traditionally this was having to do with more military operations. And then collective defense gets to the heart of the, of what NATO does, its Article 5 commitments. But what we argue is that we should expect actually to see adaptation on climate in areas that are farther away from that defense-centered identity. So as the, starting with 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea, and then that defense, centered identity being even pushed farther to the forefront with Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that we theorize that what's happening is that externally, we should see a lot of focus on NATO adapting in the area of collective defense, because that's key and part and parcel of what it does, but that in reality, internally, we expected to see adaptation to be more on these core tasks that are farther away for the purposes of protecting NATO's really collective defense identity. So externally, again, projecting, yes, of course, this is, we're adapting, but that instead internally, we should see this more on the margins. So I've already listed this. We tested a few competing hypotheses. Maybe this is a U.S. hegemonic, kind of U.S.-driven adaptation that we're seeing. Maybe this is really more about energy security. Maybe this is about resource constraints and budgets. We interviewed 63 NATO elites from across the alliance, including, I didn't list this here, but we also included some bureaucrats, some NATO bureaucrats as well, and the international staff. And then we also provided a one-page survey instrument. In addition to the interviews that we did. This is a sample. I'm happy to come back to this during the Q&A, but just to show you that we tried to get some, as much as we could, a sample that covered the regions, the different regions of NATO. Maybe it's interesting to point out here that we did struggle with the commands. We were able to speak on the margins with folks from from ACT. We were able to go to ACO and interview folks there. We were not able to interview folks at ACT, and we had a lot of resistance from the operational commands despite months of trying to go out and visit that, to organize that. So again, Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about that. So what we see, which was kind of interesting from the one-page survey, is that we saw that most of the adaptation, and this is perception, I need to be very clear about this, because what you're seeing is individuals reporting their perceptions of adaptation. And these interviews were conducted 2023 and 2024. So this is before the Trump administration has come in and had a resetting of climate policy. But we see a lot of focus on resilience. So at that point, we saw less of a perception that adaptation and that movement was happening in the areas of defense planning, capability delivery, that matched up with some of the documentation that we've seen also. We heard less about operational planning at this stage, but disaster response was forefront. In terms of the coding that we did of these different the interviews, the qualitative content analysis, we saw a lot of examples back to cooperative security as climate as being an opportunity to work with our partners and to learn from our partners. But again, you kept hearing something that you've heard on the, what you've heard yesterday and a little bit touched on earlier this morning, this idea that, we can't at any cost compromise NATO's ability to defend and deter, right? Defense and deterrence comes first. And so there is this still lingering perception of that there's a trade-off there. And so, anything touching on collective defense, things related to Ukraine, very, very politically sensitive. We didn't see support for this U.S. hegemonic stability. We ended up seeing that from the qualitative content analysis, and then also My co-author spent time looking at national security strategies and comparing them with NATO documents to kind of see to what extent are we seeing some of that language brought in. We didn't see as much. And what was also really interesting was the champions. So figuring out, who are the countries that these elites, these NATO elites, are perceiving as the champions. Thank you. We saw the UK, we saw Canada. We did see the US mentioned, but the UK being really mentioned most frequently. The Ukraine as an exogenous shock idea, we did see some moderate support. You see this quote here, we must make sure not to replace one dependency with another. So there were concerns about, even though this is, what's happening in Ukraine is maybe presenting opportunities. I hate to use that language for such an absolute tragic, tragic situation, but I'm trying to reflect back, the quotes that we heard was that there were concerns that as that greening happened, what does this mean then to then create dependencies on, say, China for some of these natural resources and rare earths and things like that, and lithium in particular. We need to solve the war first, then worry about going green. So we didn't see really as much support for the budget impact. This was not something that was brought in a lot in the conversations that we were hearing. That doesn't mean that budgets don't matter. Budgets do matter, but that this was not necessarily something that was driving the variation that we were seeing. I would just say on the barriers, I wanted to read one quote. So I'm not sure how much you can see in the back there, but focus on conventional threats, right? What does this mean for deterrence if we make this full switch? The military, one quote was, the military says, why should we do it? We tell them this is a heads of state tasking. We're trying to get a political tasking down. It's a nightmare to engage the military on this. I've been at NATO a long time, and this is a real severe problem. We are unable to see the forest for the trees, and my worry is that we won't have the people or the resources to tackle it. One maybe silver lining is just that I would mention that NATO has really spent so much time working on these issues that it has been heavily institutionalized. So in every single delegation, there is someone who has in their portfolio climate in the same way that it's been institutionalized with WPS or someone who's working on their NATO desk on counterterrorism, and that you do have a lot of hiring that's happened in the international staff of real experts on climate security. So just to kind of review some of those findings really quickly, we think some of the contributions that we're putting forward are an argument on why this is happening in the ways that it is. We also provide really some pretty thick descriptions. I'm looking forward to hopefully soon this paper being published so that we can, so you can see a lot more of these quotes. But I'm also happy during lunch break if anybody wants to, to talk more about that and really bringing forward some empirical evidence from these elites on drivers. The very last thing I'll just plug is that Jackie and I had a paper that goes through a series of policy recommendations based on a lot of the interview data that we did that was published in the Atlantic Council. So it's just one of the Atlantic Council pieces out there that you could look up if you're curious about hearing more about leadership and training and the role of climate advisors, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. That concludes this panel on the multilateral dynamics at NATO and the EU.